We are ready. Normally, when I do a PowerPoint presentation, I've gone through the school rigmarole, and like to think I'm quite good at it, especially my language arts. So normally I think a good PowerPoint is one that is concise and focused and well rehearsed. I did not rehearse this one even once. I finished it last night. So, that's okay, because the point of this is I get to talk about the tale of Genji for as long as I want. There are 18 slides. Some of them I'll probably be on for only like a minute. Some of them I'll probably be on for like 20 minutes. It will be entertaining. It will have passion. It will be pretty, educational. And I will stumble and forget the stuff I wanted to say on like half the slides. But we're gonna have fun. That's all that matters. What I'm going to talk to you about today, I'm going to tell you what is the Tale of Genji. What am I talking about? What is this silly book in my hands? I will tell you why it is important. And there is a difference between important and good. I am not here to tell you this is my casual reading recommendation. This will be the best thing you've ever read. It's written better than anything else, and its characters are cooler than any others. No, incorrect. What I am going to teach you is, regardless of how much you may personally enjoy the Tale of Genji, or how you feel about its content, the Tale of Genji is valuable. It is important. And I am forced to make this point because there are some people who you will hear why people dislike the character Hikaru Genji. And they go, oh, well, he sucks real bad and he does horrible things and no one should ever read this story. It's yucky and bad. They are wrong. And I will prove this irrefutably. This is not an this is an opinionated PowerPoint, but I am teaching you facts. And the fact is this book is important. The opinion is that it's also very cool. Despite that, you may be surprised to learn that I will only sort of tell you what the book is actually about. Whenever I talk to people about the Tale of Genji, they go, okay, you've said a lot of things, but like, what happens in it? Doesn't matter. Regardless of what happens in it, it's really important. That isn't to say you won't learn things, but you may think this would be all about telling you about the plot and themes and characters and events. No. It's only sorta kinda about those. But mostly it's about other things, such as what we can learn from reading Genji today. And where do we see Genji still bothering us now? And also, in every time period that has existed since Genji's existence. And then, of course, how long can Aster Gardenia talk without breathing? Now that we know what we are going to learn today, let us start the learning. What is Genji Monogatari? The Tale of Genji is widely, in broad terms, called the first novel. This is bonkers, because it was written around the year 1100. And people have had thoughts and told stories for pretty much our entire existence. So what the hell do you mean that no one wrote a book until the 11th century? It's an easy point to argue. So then people will sort of specify, oh, it's the first romantic novel. It is the first classic novel that we still think of today as a classic. It is the first psychological novel. You think of like those really, really old stories, like a Greek mythology thing. You get a lot of like, Zeus saw so-and-so and he wanted to hook up with them, so he did. And Hera saw and was angered, so she punished them. A lot of just stating people's motives plainly, and they would be pretty static. Genji is thought of as one of the first stories to have characters that would have more subtle and transforming motives that wouldn't be, like, told to you directly, but you'd see them unfold over time or through their actions. This is a story where people can lie about what they think. They can be hypocritical over time. They change over time. This is one of the first ever pieces of writing, at least that we still have, that we know existed, that does those things. And then I like to say that Genji Monogatari is the first harem story, because it really is. It's about a frickin' womanizer. It's a really, really old book that we still have today because people back then thought it was super good and preserved it so that we still have it and can read it. And as said, it was written in the 11th century in the Heian Era of Japan by Murasaki Shikibu. Or at least we call her that. We'll get into names later. The Heian Era is a very interesting time. And I really should have put in the what will we learn, like the what can we learn from Genji? We can learn a lot about the Heian period, and the Heian period is wild. This book, however, it is 54 chapters long. It was written over a period of years on scrolls that were copied and recopied and slowly corrupted by people making their own edits or typos. It was a whole thing, but the first 44 chapters are about the character Genji, and then he dies, and the last 10 chapters are about his children. Follows the life of the son of an emperor who is sort of disowned because he's... I covered this in a different slide, but I want to cover it here anyway. His mother is low-ranking, and so he's not likely to do much by being part of the royal family, and so instead he's sort of let go to rise above his station as a commoner, and he frickin' does. Oh boy, does he. He gets up to some stuff. It's very much a story that takes place in the context of Heian Era noble culture, and you'll see why that's important and interesting. Genji, as I said, it was written on a series of scrolls that were copied and recopied, and the time when it was written, the Japanese language did not exist yet as we know it today. Japan did not have its current writing system until the Meiji era, which was 2 whole eras after this. I didn't look up the exact years, and I'm bad with years, but several hundred years later. 100 years after this was written, no one could read it without studying history, which is what someone did. A bunch of nobles went, oh geez, we don't want to not be able to read Genji anymore. Can you imagine the horror? And they went and they collected all of these handwritten copies and compared them to figure out the discrepancies between them all and try to recreate a complete Genji that then had to be retranslated into modern Japanese again later, back in Meiji. Yes, Middle English version of Japanese. And back during the Heian era, men wrote entirely in Chinese characters. They weren't speaking Chinese, but they were using Chinese characters, but women were not supposed to learn those. It was considered ugly, basically. It was unattractive. And for noble women, that could substantially hurt their reputation. So many of them did know Chinese, but they played that on the down low. And so women were the ones that invented hiragana. Katakana didn't exist until much later. And so that is Japanese's phonetic alphabet. So Japanese has a lot of homophones. Yeah, this thing was not easy to read. Especially because it was the Middle English equivalent of Japanese. So it was a time. The oldest existing copy of The Tale of Genji is Genji Monogatari Emaki, which is a series of Yamanote picture scrolls. They are also the oldest existing Yamanote picture scrolls, period, that we have that aren't Buddhist scripture. we actually only have 15% of the complete Genji Monogatari Maki. So this is not the one that we've based our translations from. Funny thing with when the conservation efforts started, like preserving Genji, there were actually several scholars who set about doing this, and because there were so many discrepancies between all of the different handwritten copies, we actually have several versions of Genji that are slightly different, and those are all independently referred to by the name of their translator and studied. Genji is a field of study. It's wild. The 15% of the full Genji Monogatari Maki are considered Japanese national treasures. They have been split up between 2 museums, and they aren't even on exhibit most of the time because preserving them is so important. Genji old. Yeah, this is what the Genji Monogatari Maki look like. The written portions of it, there are also the pretty pictures, but yeah, this is... People had to work really hard to translate and transcribe this, because scholars believe that this wasn't easy to read even for people during the time it was written, but it was part of the aesthetic. Genji is a very aesthetic experience. Yeah, they were not willing to compromise aesthetic. Everything has to be gentle and flowing and not very easy to read. Yes, doctored scribbles. I have not been to see the original text in the museum. Unfortunately, I did not catch my Genji fever until towards the end of my time living in Japan. There's a whole Genji museum and I want to go so bad. Okay, so how do we read Genji today? So the first modern language translation into Japanese was written in the early 20th century. The first complete English translation was in 1976, and we actually have 3 or 4 major English Genji translations that all handle the localization process, you could say, differently. Genji is full of a lot of poems that you want to like translate the aesthetic, but also there's a whole bunch of lost cultural context, but also like making it sound natural, and the Japanese translations have to deal with a lot of this too. I personally prescribe, in terms of English translations, to the Tyler Royal version of Genji, and if I refer to chapter names, I will be using the Tyler Royal translations. His translation is the one that tries to have the most fidelity to aesthetic and form, and has a lot of footnotes. So many footnotes, and I love them. I love the footnotes. Oh, reversed. We're getting to that. Modern translators, starting with the Japanese, they had to add chapter names, which are mostly named after parts of major poems in the chapter. And then scholars invented the names of all the characters. Back in the Heian Era, it was considered very rude to refer to any nobility by their name. So they don't do that. The name Hikaru Genji, we made that up. Every other character is referred to mostly by a title they have or by their relationship to someone that does have a title. And those, like, people get promotions. Their titles change over time, and this tale takes place over a lifetime. We're gonna get into this, but this is what the beginning of every chapter looks like. It's just a list of people's titles, and then in the parentheses, you have what scholars have nicknamed all of the characters just so that we can talk about it. And all of those are just references to poems they wrote or poems about them. No one has names. Genji is wild. As you can tell from just that, the Heian Era was a very particular time. We're going to get to so many more examples, but basically, even translated into modern Japanese or modern English, you still don't know what the hell is happening without a billion footnotes. Part of that is that it was also incredibly rude to speak to someone face to face, or for a man to see a woman above the wrist. And so things you know about romance stories or just books, normally characters will talk to each other and the story will describe their reactions and their emotions via their facial expressions or their voice. None of that is happening. Everyone is writing each other poems, and these poems are all half oblique references to the poems of the Kokinshu and also the Manyoshu, which are government-mandated collections of like court-approved good poetry. And all nobles during this time were expected to have all of those poems memorized. And so the way that nobility would communicate with each other is they would write each other poems in reference to these poems, and they would only write like half of it and just expect you. It's like when in Rome. You don't need to complete that sentence because everyone's supposed to know it. Everyone was communicating by doing that with poems all the time. And so modern readers have not memorized the Kokinshu. And so there needs to be so many footnotes to explain what that random fragment of a poem was actually communicating to the other person. And scholars had to do a lot of work to figure out what all those poems were referencing and what those poems meant to another person during this time. The TV tropes page for the Tale of Genji makes me so happy. It makes me so valid. So I took one of the tropes, speaks and shoutouts. Some of these poems are still known to scholars today. The rest is lost on readers. And we have just a page from the second chapter of Genji. There's some things about the type of room they would have been standing in. And then there's this sentence: stringed instruments are played together in spring, and Genji was a little worried about the false notes. And then a little note to footnote 52 that just says, the meaning of this sentence is unclear. What the hell does that mean? No one knows. People studied really hard to figure out what the rest of it meant, though. So yes, let's look at names. These are the chapters Under the Cherry Blossoms and Heart the Heart. I believe those are chapters 8 and 9. Only one chapter in between these, but in between those two chapters, the emperor retires and his son becomes the new emperor. The heir apparent becomes the new emperor. And so this is a small example of how much people's titles and how they are referred to in the text change, but basically every chapter you go for this list and figure out who is who. Genji, a consultant, age 20. Next chapter, he is the commander of the right. His Majesty the Emperor in the next chapter is referred to as His Eminence, the retired emperor. That one you can sort of figure out. Her Majesty the Empress how is she still the Empress? Good for her. Oh, because Suzaku hasn't married yet, that makes sense. The Kokiden Consort, mother of the heir apparent. Well, next chapter, the heir apparent is no longer heir apparent, he's now the emperor. So the Kokiden Consort is now the Empress mother. The Secretary Captain becomes the third rank captain, and also Aoi's brother, because I guess that's relevant in this chapter. Tono Chujo. I have so much to say about Tono Chujo. The Minister of the Left becomes His Excellency the Minister of the Left because Aoi and Tono Chujo have increased their rankings, and so the Minister of the Left gets a better title. Some of these don't change too much. Some of them are a completely different thing than they were in the last chapter. This is just how you read Genji. Because these names in parentheses, it's not true to the text to use those. You use the titles, and the reader just has to follow along. And readers during the time would just, through various context clues, be able to follow this because they were used to not ever referring to people by names. It's amazing. It's like half an hour into this presentation. That doesn't seem right. Like 20 minutes into this presentation, am I going to tell you who the hell Genji the dude is? Okay, I guess if I have to. Like I said before, Genji is at the beginning of the story. He is the son of the current emperor and one of his low-ranking mistresses. And oh boy, I love talking about the Fujiwara clan. So the emperor would have lots of women, and which one would become the empress was not actually that much determined by who the emperor favored. It was determined by politics. The Fujiwara clan during this time had a sort of stranglehold on the running of the palace. The Fujiwara clan's deal was basically they would send their daughters to the emperor to have her become the empress, because if she did, then that member of the Fujiwara clan would get to raise the next emperor, because the child of that empress would be raised in her father's home. And so they were puppeteering all of the generations of emperor. So the emperor, he had this girl who was so beautiful and wonderful, but she was low ranking, and he really wanted to make her son the heir apparent. But if he did that, the Fujiwara clan, who was probably included his grandfather and was puppeting him, and also a bunch of the highest ranking nobles in court, would have been really pissed off at him. So he couldn't do that, and he was sad, because the actual empress's kid would become the next emperor, and Genji wouldn't get to really do anything special. So he grants this child the name Genji, which Genji is... it stands for Minamoto, and Minamoto was actually the name given to children of the emperor who, when you gave them a last name, they became commoners. The emperor doesn't have a last name, apparently. The name Hikaru Genji just means the shining Minamoto, the shining disowned emperor's son, basically, because he doesn't have a name either. We call him Genji, but his name is not Genji. So, we know where he comes from, but what's he about? What's he doing? He's the protagonist of the first 44 chapters of this story. What's he up to? Well, what he's up to, we start the story when he is 12, and he has a giant Oedipus complex because his mother died, and the emperor was so sad that his favorite lady died, that he went and found her cousin, Fujitsubo, who apparently looks like exactly like her, and immediately adopted her into the harem. And Genji grew up going, wow, this stepmom that looks just like my mom apparently is the most beautiful woman alive, and I'm gonna be weird about that. But getting with the emperor's lady is not a good idea. So instead, he goes after like every other lady that he can see. The first chapter is like, this is Genji, this is his story, and this is how he's weird with his mom. The second chapter, The Broom Tree, is about Genji is now like 15, palling around with his bros and talking about women they'd want to smash. And they're just awful. They're just the worst. This is why I told you Genji isn't good. Chapter 3 is Genji breaks into a woman's house and tries to get with her while she's like, please leave my home. In chapter 5, he finds the young cousin of his stepmom, who also is super beautiful, and she's also 8 years old. And he kidnaps her and marries her. And then she is the Lady Murasaki. The name Murasaki Shikibu? Not her name. Not the name of the offer. It's the nickname we gave her based on her most famous female character. Basically, in terms of like Japanese art history, literature history, Genji and Murasaki are like the Romeo and Juliet quintessential, perfect, beautiful, wonderful couple, and it's gross! So that's a whole thing. Genji is supposedly the most talented at everything. There is so much time spent going, wow, Genji, he dresses super well, his poetry is the smartest and most beautiful, his handwriting is impeccable, everyone is swooning. He did a dance during a festival that just drove people crazy. There's a whole chapter dedicated to he rides by in a cart during a festival, and a few of the women he's courting really want to see him pass by because it's so good to look at him, and they get into a fight over a parking spot in the parade line where they can see him, and one of those ladies gets so mad that she curses the other woman to death, and she dies. It's dumb! Genji, he starts out like in his teens, and the early portions of the story are his fuckboy phase. He's just flirting around everywhere ridiculously. The sort of transition when he's gaining more political power because everyone loves him and he's so good at everything. I believe how it goes, and I haven't reread this section lately, so this is just sort of off the top of my head. He sleeps with the secretary of a major noble. She's this old lady, but apparently she's like a really hot old lady, and his bro, his buddy, Tono Chujo, I think was also sleeping with her, and they get in a big fight and expose each other, and Genji gets driven out of the capital for a few years, where he gets another wife because he lands on this small island, and the guy there's like, oh my god, it's Genji, the best, most wonderful person ever. Please, 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 please marry my daughter. And Genji's like, no, I have the most best, perfect wife at home, and I don't want your daughter. And he's like, no, you gotta. And basically forces them together, and he comes back with a new wife, and then he makes a big house where he hosts all of his wives. And then he gets older and becomes, instead of just a ridiculous fuckboy who's impulsively going around being entitled as hell, and like, it's funny because the narrative spends all this time going, oh, he's the most beautiful, he's endlessly attractive, he's so smart, but then when he does something messed up, like kidnap an 8-year-old to marry her, everyone still reacts appropriately. They go, hey, please don't do that, what the hell are you doing? It's really good in the third chapter where he starts his womanizing. That's one of the few girls, Utsusemi, that does not frickin' take him, will not do it. She ends the novel as a nun who has sworn off men completely, that he goes and visits and gives gifts to, because the thing that makes Genji so great, sarcasm, is that anytime he sexually harasses a woman at any point in his life, he does go on to take care of her for the rest of her life. He's weird. He's so weird. But he goes from this impulsive little brat to this very entitled frickin' boomer who just loves to hear himself talk because he knows that everyone thinks he's the smartest and bestest and most correct. He'll be talking to his wife Murasaki, and she goes, oh, I want to take the vows. I would like to become a nun before I die. And he goes, no, you know what? I think taking the vows is bad, and you know, women should like writing poetry and embracing the joys of life and living in my house. And then he goes to his daughter, and she goes, I sure do love playing the biwa. And he goes, you know, the fact that you are so into playing the biwa shows that you are immature, because you are so attached to these transient, meaningless joys in life, and you should be thinking more spiritually, and if you were older and wiser, you would know that. And he's not consistent, because he doesn't care. It's not a writing mistake, it's the fact that he is obnoxious. And that's what Genji is like, and I have lots of feelings about him. Back when I was in school, I did a much smaller PowerPoint presentation on Genji, and one of the slides was just a picture of him with his face crossed out and the words "Saite na otoko," worst man. But he obtains a made-up title that never existed, called an honorary emperor, because he never becomes emperor. but he becomes so powerful and popular that he's basically treated like a retired emperor, which is the highest station you can possibly ever have, and then he dies. And it's really funny when he dies, because the chapter is called, like, The Emperor Ascends into the Clouds, and it's just the title, it's blank. And then the next chapter, they're holding their funeral, and then his kid is the main character. Amazing. That's more than we ever want to talk about Hikaru Genji, but unfortunately we do have to talk about him more, because this is the part where I actually tell you things that happen in the book. Because one thing that happens in the book is girls. He has many of them. Here are some of them. I will tell you about some of the ladies. You will hear, therefore, many of his escapades. Most of these images are from the manga, The Shining Genji. It's one of the manga adaptations. Here's my cursor. This picture of Yugao is a woodblock print. I don't know the source of this one. This is just a picture of a safflower. I don't know the source of this one, but it's freaking everywhere and it's like my favorite thing. Do we not know how he dies? Genji dies of grief a little bit after Murasaki dies. But they don't go into it very much. He's very, very sad that his favoriteest wife of all dies. And then he does. He dies. In the time, there was a very specific way noble women fashioned themselves. I believe this was the period where they blacked their teeth. Basically, you kept your hair long and straight. You had these little funky tassels. And you wore big, pretty robe. A struggle for any adaptation of Genji that has a visual component is that all these ladies look the same. But also, if it is a true adaptation of Genji, you will never see these women because they are always behind screens. So, it's a struggle. Adapting Genji into anything is very, very difficult. But that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about all these ladies that Genji meets, which the vast majority of the cast are the women that Genji runs into. There are a few men, like Tono Chujo is one of the reoccurring male characters, who is one of his wives' brothers. And then there's like some emperors, but mostly we're here for the ladies. We talked about Fujitsubo. Fujitsubo is basically Genji's stepmom that he gets the hots for in his youth. And, Squicky, yucky. He does eventually get with her. Because he, like, lives in the Emperor's house growing up, because she's there. He eventually does have a secret affair with her, and she has a child named Reize, who, because she was at the time the Emperor's favored wife, he becomes the next heir apparent after Genji's older brother. And it's a big secret that it's not actually the Emperor's child that succeeds him, but Genji's. And they both kind of live in fear of it being found out, and it's a big drama. And also it's freaking weird, because she looks like his mom. And yeah. Genji's most favoritist wife, Murasaki, and Genji was in this picture, but I cut him out because he's yucky and I don't want to look at him. Murasaki is the little girl that Genji kidnaps when she's 8 years old because she looks a lot like his stepmom that he can't get with. And the conclusion of chapter 2 of Genji, the broom tree, a bunch of guys talk about a bunch of misadventures they had courting women, but then, like, the women were mad when they did bad things, or knew Chinese, which was so unattractive. She sent him poetry with Chinese characters in it. Chinese character using lady in broom tree, best girl, frickin' girl boss. Anyway, not any of these ladies. They talk about all these ladies. I posted a bit of Genji on Twitter the other day about a girl that bit some guy's finger while he was breaking up with her. They tell all these stories about womanizing going bad, and eventually go, man, it would be great if we could just, you know, shape a woman to be well-behaved and well-mannered and good. That would really be the only way to get the perfect woman. And yucky, yucky, grooming. Genji goes and does exactly that, and he grabs Murasaki. And she does become the most well-mannered, perfect, beautifuliest woman ever, and everyone, as she's growing up, goes, wow, Murasaki is so good. And all the readers are going, I hate this. But Murasaki does have to deal with the fact that that doesn't stop him from seeing all these other women, because dating and marriage in the Heian era was not really an official thing. How dating worked was the man would go visit the woman at her house. They would exchange poems for a long time, and eventually he'd break into her bedroom during the night and then leave in the morning so no one caught him. This wasn't just a Genji thing. This is literally what everyone was doing, and it was the socially acceptable way to go about relationships. And so the woman basically just had to hope he kept coming, and if he stopped coming, that basically meant the relationship was over. And these women, they didn't get to do much of anything except write poems and learn to play the biwa. So their whole kind of standing in noble society rested on the title of the man that they were with. And so they would be really desperate to maintain those relationships often. Though they had standards. Utsusemi, best girl. So Genji was going off and just sort of regularly visiting several women, and that was just normal. There was not a lot of monogamy, though women still did get jealous. So one of the first women Genji met, I told you a bit about Utsusemi from chapter 3. He exploited a thing that is really funny to me. Basically, in the Heian era, there were, based on, I think it was the phase of the moon, there were certain directions it was considered unsafe to travel in. It was inauspicious. And so Genji hacked this plan where he rode over to Utsusemi's house, and then the way to go back to his own place was an inauspicious direction of travel. So he's like, well, I can't go back. You just have to let me stay the night. And Utsusemi was like, get the hell out of here. But her brother was super into Genji. So Genji, snuck in her room, got booted out, and then found her brother following him, and he goes, you're close enough, you'll do. Because also, heterosexuality was not so much of an important thing back then. And then Utsusemi's little brother just follows him around for a chapter or two, and that was very early in my reading of Genji, and I just went, wait, what? And I had to ask in my Japanese art history class if I read that correctly, because, of course, all of these anecdotes are given in these subtle ways, because being direct about anything is, of course, vulgar and wouldn't ever happen. So there are all these little euphemisms about sharing robes or perfume left on sleeves, and that means they boned. So that's Utsusemi. We should talk about Aoi. Aoi is actually Genji's arranged marriage when he was young. He got in an arranged marriage with a slightly older girl. He was 12, she was 15, and she was mean to him. Aoi was mean. So Genji didn't like her, and that's why he kept running out and visiting Utsusemi and kidnapping children. And Genji he gets along great with Aoi's brother, Tono Chujo. They're broing it up and chatting about womanizing, and then they have to devote at least a couple sentences to Tono Chujo going, and oh, when he looked at Genji, how he wished that Genji was a woman because he was so attractive. And this is just a thing that happens all the time. Aoi is sort of tied with one of the major contributions that the Tale of Genji has to Japanese art and aesthetics in general, and that her chapter where she dies, that is a chapter that sort of solidified and caused the term mono no oware to be tokenized. It was first defined in an essay about Genji. But Mono no Oware, I've read it being called like a cornerstone of Japanese identity, but it is this sort of aesthetic philosophy that things that are fleeting and doomed to only be there for a short moment are intrinsically beautiful. It's part of why the sakura blossom is the Japanese national flower. Sakura are considered one of the biggest examples of Mono no Oware. The seasons, which like the Kokinchu, any haiku, are really, really into the seasons. The seasons are beautiful because eventually they will go away. The blossoms will wilt, and then the trees in summer, their leaves will color and fall, and then they will fall away in winter, and then the snow will fall and it is beautiful, but then it will melt on your hand and it will all melt away for spring. That sort of thing, the fact that it ends and therefore you must treasure it while you have it, is considered one of the themes of Genji, and something that Genji is used as one of the major examples of. What happens is, how Aoi ties into that is one of my favorite chapters, the carriage battle. Aoi being Genji's actual wife, the arranged marriage, she positions her cart to see Genji go by in the parade. And there's another woman who, we don't know how she got with Genji. She just pops into being, going, the Rokujo Haven. She's been in a long-standing relationship with Genji, and she shows up wanting to see him. And so she goes to position her cart along the parade route, and Aoi's attendants are all drunk as hell and know that their mistress has the most rights to this spot, so they start shoving Rokujo's cart out of the way and make her very, very mad. And so Rokujo becomes so consumed with envy that Genji has these other women and that are blocking her from being able to even look upon his face as he goes by in a parade route, that her envy possesses her in the night and she becomes a twisted spirit. And while Aoi is giving birth to Genji's first child, the spirit of Rokujo comes and attacks her, and she dies. And up until this point, Genji never liked Aoi because she was just the lady who was mean to him. But in that moment, he's holding his firstborn child and watching the life fade from her eyes, and in that moment he goes, wow, actually, Aoi is beautiful. And it's weird, but that moment is sort of like the codifier for Mono no Oware. And Rokujo goes on to continue haunting and killing women that Genji sleeps with. And then she kind of wakes up and goes, oh no, I'm haunted! This sucks and is bad and I'm a danger to society. And she goes get herself purified in a temple. And when I was first reading Genji, the Rokujo Haven was my favorite character. And I cannot explain to you why, but the affection persists regardless. She is a woman scorned, and she could not bring herself to actually kill Genji. It's half implied that he's like actually divinely blessed and she's incapable of haunting him to death. She can only haunt the women he loves instead. But could also just be that she can't bear to harm him, but also is very mad and needs to give him a lesson. So this picture, this very, very cool picture, is Aoi being haunted to death by Lady Rokujo. And I don't know if it's one of the first or just one of the most famous no plays, is the story of Aoi and Rokujo's ghost in theater performances is denoted by this like yellow or orange robe being just kind of pulled over her head and shoulders like a veil. That's just sort of the language of no, but they're referencing it here in this image, and it's neato. And I will go into this more later, but I was reading Genji my first time for a class, for a Japanese art history class, and after we read Genji, Genji kept showing up in every unit afterwards, so we'd go like, oh, let's learn about no plays in Kabuki theater. Genji reference! That was what made me realize just how influential this story was, and then gave me brainworms. The Lady Yugao is at times considered Genji's, like, first love, which I think means he hadn't actually kidnapped Murasaki yet. Yeah, Murasaki was the chapter after Yugao. It's just she's so important that I talk about her very early. At this point, Genji is married or engaged to Aoi and doesn't really like her. He's tried hitting on Utsusemi by breaking into her house against her will, and that has not gone well. And so he goes to, like, a summer house of his, and there's another house nearby with a commoner girl. But the commoner girl sees this big, fancy, noble carriage pull up with the most perfectest, most beautiful man in the whole world inside. And so she has one of her handmaidens send over a paper fan with a poem written on it and one of the Yugao flowers that are growing on her property. And it is a beautiful poem and a beautiful fan and beautiful handwriting and a beautiful flower. And Genji immediately goes, I need to meet this girl. And so breaks into her house in the middle of the night, goes like, I am madly in love with you. And she's like, but I am a commoner. You could never be with me. And so he kidnaps her and takes her to a different house he has. This is supposed to be Genji's, like, coming of age. This is more in tune with, like, a more accurate comparison to Romeo and Juliet, which people say is about, like, true love, but it's mostly about kids being really impulsive. But Genji takes Yugao to a house where no one can find them and is like, I'm gonna, like, freaking marry you right here. And then she gets haunted to death and dies. And people don't 100% contribute that to Rokujo. Some of them contribute it to Aoi, but one of his ladies was like, excuse me? And so his true love that is requited and she's so perfect is cut short because the very night he tries to make a move on her, she dies of ghost haunting. And then he's very sad until he finds an 8-year-old and kidnaps her. And that one, unfortunately, works out way better for him. Yeah. Isn't this a fun book? We'll talk about things that aren't horrible atrocities soon, but we have 2 more women to talk about. One is not important at all, but I find her story funny, I guess. I shouldn't, but I do. I didn't even find a picture of her. I found her namesake, the Safflower. Yes, Lady Safflower. At some point during the story, Genji goes to meet this woman that he's heard good things about her. I think she's high-ranking. And her poetry is not the most attractive, but it's decent. And he goes to pursue a relationship with her, and he's been exchanging poems with her for a while, and he finally comes to her house to sort of make the relationship official. And he's there with her, and he can see her sleeves underneath the standing screen because, of course, he's not just in a room with her. That would be scandalous. That would be unthinkable, unheard of. And her sleeves are sort of not poorly arranged, but they are stiff and unattractive. And then she's holding up a fan, and when he finally comes to the other side of the screen, while he's kind of going, I'm getting some weird vibes, and she pulls the fan down, and her nose is big and shiny and red. And he goes, oh, I actually don't want to go through with this, actually. I'm realizing now that we aren't exchanging poems that you're kind of gross. But he's come too far, so he sort of, like, spends the night and leaves. And the Lady Safflower is named after her nose being red. Safflower was the flower that was ground up to create red dyes for robes. And so he never is intimate with her again, but because he did sort of lead her on that long, he spends the rest of his life taking care of her and sending her gifts and paying her visits every once in a while, even into his old age, and it's just very funny to me. Lady Akashi, I told you about how Genji slept with the Ron MILF and got himself exiled, and was boated off to this small island where some guy was like, please marry my daughter. She's such a good daughter. You'll love my daughter. And Genji's like, no, I have the perfectest, most beautifulest wife in the whole world, Murasaki. But, I mean, I guess I am really lonely because I'm far from home and exiled and can't go back for a while. And your daughter is quite pretty. But no, swear, I have Murasaki. And then the dad just keeps, like, shoving them in the same room together until he finally sleeps with her and she gets pregnant. And he's like, well, damn, I guess I do have to marry you now. And so she likes him, but she's very, insecure because he does have a more favorite-ier wife, and she's a little bit of a country bumpkin, but she's very pretty. I mentioned before, Genji has a house where he keeps a bunch of his favorite wives. Murasaki, he has one house for each of the 4 seasons, and he puts a different wife in them. So Murasaki, his principal wife, is his Lady of Spring, and Lady Akashi is actually, she's named for the season of fall because she is his Lady of Fall, and has his second child, which Murasaki is not super keen about. So to make her feel better about it, Genji gives that Lady Akashi's child to Murasaki to raise into a fine young woman, and then Akashi's kind of awkward about that, and Murasaki's like, okay, you trust me to raise this child the best. And that child is a girl, so they're like, we need to get this daughter raised up to be the most beautiful so that she can flirt with Emperor Reize and become his principal wife so that Genji becomes the grandfather of the next emperor type of deal. Or not Emperor Reize, Emperor Suzaku. Anyway, so they live in the same house and they write each other letters and it's like awkward and they're trying to get along. It's a whole thing. There's drama. It's Genji. And then, there are other women that just, like, I don't remember off the top of my head, like Tama Kazuda. Apparently she's pretty important. I forgot about her. Unfortunately, I cannot forget San no Miya, which is the last woman that Genji takes. Which he actually sort of takes against his will, for once. For once. Which is, when Emperor Suzaku retires, he calls Genji over to his house, and he's like, hey, I'm the retired emperor, which is the most privileged position you can possibly have in the Heian Era. You have to be nice to me. I have 2 granddaughters, and I want them to go to the best home possible, to have the best, like, power, standing in society. I want to do well by them. You should marry one of my granddaughters. And Genji's like, isn't she like 12 or something? I'm like 40 at this point. And he goes, but she's a princess and there's literally no better place I could put her because you're the bestest and most amazing. And Genji goes, no, you know, I used to do the whole pedophilia and grooming thing, but I've grown out of that. I'm over that. I already did it the best I ever could because I have Murasaki. Yeah, so Genji's like, I'm so over that, and she's like a child. It's not cute anymore to me. I've grown out of that. And Emperor Suzaku's like, but please? And he goes, fine, I guess I'll marry San no Miya. And Murasaki's like, she's way higher ranking than me. That would kind of make her your principal wife. And Genji's like, but everyone knows you're the principal wife. But because she is a imperial princess, I am obligated to spend time with her, because if I don't, it would be an insult to the retired emperor, and that would be very bad. So, sorry, Murasaki. I know we have movie dates every Friday, but I need to start seeing San no Miya on Fridays. And Murasaki's like, I hate this. And Genji's like, I also kind of hate this. And he spends time with San no Miya, just kind of going, she's so immature and obnoxious. And then he invites a bunch of his bros over to play kickball among the beautiful cherry blossoms, and all these guys are in their big tall hats and giant pantaloons, kicking a ball around. And it turns out Sanomiya, gasp, can you imagine? Left her screen door slightly open, and the kickball goes through there. And Tono Chujo, Genji's stepbro slash like bro, goes like, yo, there's an imperial princess here, indecent, because I can see her, she's fully clothed, but like seeing a woman above the wrist, gasp. And so he sleeps with Sanomiya, and Genji's like, what the hell, bro? And it's a whole thing, because she gets pregnant, and Genji has to cover it up, because or else it would be him being irresponsible with his princess wife, but also he's blaming her, because she was indecent and immature enough to leave her door open. And this is just how Genji works. It's... you get the vibe. Okay, let's stop talking about this. So, yeah. It's a interesting setting. It's an interesting story. Those who came in later, no one in the story has names. I called all these people by names. Those are nicknames historians came up with, like hundreds of years after the story was written so that we could talk about it. Every chapter in the story, their titles change from chapter to chapter, and the scholars of Genji and the translators of Genji gave all the characters nicknames so that we can map them across chapters. I could be wrong about Sanomiya's age, but I'm pretty sure she was like 12. They're freaking gross. They're freaking gross. Genji commits all of the crimes. All of them. He's the worst. Saite na otoko. Hassan, thank you for the resub, and thank you. I am forcing everyone to deal with the worst... I want to call it the worst story of all time, but I made a whole PowerPoint saying that it's like important, and this is why I said it's not good. It's just important. And we'll go back to that subject, even though I have subjected you all to the horrors of its actual story content. You can see why some people want this thing thrown in the fire and never remembered. But yes, so this story, it's not like most of your romance stories today, in that no one has names. No one talks to each other directly. I said this earlier, but for the benefit of people who came in late. You know how, like in romance books or, you know, any novel, characters will talk to each other. And when there's drama, the text will probably describe, like, the way their expressions change, or the actions they take, or what they look like. Doesn't happen. Does not happen. Because everyone is hiding behind screens and fans and writing poems. Half the dialogue is poetry references. The dating and marriage system is weird. There's also... Genji goes around and is womanizing, finding all of these different ladies. You go like, how do they know which women to like fall for if they never talk to them or look at them? And that's from the quality of their poetry, the beauty of their handwriting, and the arrangement of their sleeves. The Heian Era had this system of Junji Hote, which literally translates to like 12 colored streams, but it wasn't always 12 layers. Those are just like for the really fancy occasions. But basically there was a code, and there were like an official government code written about what seasons you should wear what combinations of colors made with exactly certain dyes, because some dyes were illegal for people of certain rank to wear. There are certain colors that only the emperor can wear, that only the empress can wear. There are certain colors that commoners are not allowed to wear. Because you'd only see these really long, heavy sleeves kind of spilling out from under these standing screens, or falling from this fan being held in front of a woman's face, you would tell how refined and sophisticated and intelligent and well-cultured she was by how she was arranging her sleeves and the quality of them. So clothing was a really big deal, and like Genji isn't the only Heian Era story that we have to experience this world through, but it is the one, probably the most, it's one of the best preserved ones that we have, and one of the largest that we have. But also, Murasaki Shikibu went hard on describing the clothing, and her descriptions is actually what we use to cross-reference a lot, like when historians went to go preserve and translate that formal code of when people could wear certain colors when and in what arrangements. They filled in gaps or like verified what they were reading by referencing the tale of Genji, because it's just one of the few preserved sources that we have to use to kind of verify what it is we think we're reading, because really archaic language and copied by hand numerous times, and the capital was constantly being set on fire like every other Thursday because all of the houses were made of wood and really tightly packed. So we are going to go up from Junji Hote to go on an extended monologue about the poetry. We are overdue for that. I have a few great metaphors to kind of key you into how fascinating this poetry is. Poems in Heian Era are memes. So if we look at our first image here, this is a like quadruple nested meme. Some of you in chat may be able to see that this is funny. At least you will get one or two of the jokes in here. Maybe you won't get all of them. Some people might not be in the very specific internet in-group to have witnessed some or all of these memes, and you look at me and go, why is this a joke? What the hell does this mean? I am in the in-group to understand all of the memes in here. I love this image, but I'm using it to illustrate that the poems that were being quoted from the Kokinshu and the Manyoshu operated in a similar way, where if you were part of the in-group, this Heian Era nobility that were all taught from a young age to memorize everything in the Kokinshu and be able to, off the cuff, just make poems that reference those poems and recognize when someone else was referencing a poem to you so you could shoot back with like the other half of that poem or a similar poem and show off how well educated you are. That is one of the ways that you showed how intelligent and refined and attractive you were. And the Pillow Book by Sei Shogunan has a lot of these, but there is one chapter in Genji. This is the Pink, chapter 26. I think it was Tono Chujo again. Frickin' Tono Chujo. It turns out he had also slept with Yugao at one point and actually had a lost daughter from her that sorta had been getting raised on the countryside, completely outside of any sort of noble culture. And then they realized that Tono Chujo was her father, and so she showed up and was kind of embarrassing for him. But also, he could see that his features were definitely in her, and Genji was like, wait, you slept with my first love who tragically died? And Tono Chujo was like, yeah, I guess she was pretty great. His daughter shows up. She tries really, really hard to fit in and to be part of this in-group. She studies, but she does it sort of badly. And you can see how this sort of dynamic works when you see someone fail to do it. So she writes a poem that looks pretty similar to other poems if you don't have the Kokinshu memorized and don't know what the heck these things mean, other than that they're in italics and feel pretty. She writes, tender as she is, the plant from Hitachi shore lawns on Query Point to see as soon as she can the billows of Tago Beach. On a surface level, that sounds like the poems, except for there's this little note. She names a whole bunch of places. Hitachi, Query Point, Inland Sea, Tago, and they're all nowhere near each other geographically. And so when she writes this poem, it just sounds ridiculous. The end of that chapter, the pink, some other noble woman getting this poem and going like, okay, we have to be sort of polite, but also this is really embarrassing. And it's hard to reply to this poem because it makes so little sense. So she has one of her noble ladies write a reply because she can't even think of one because she's too busy trying not to laugh. And poems. My second metaphor that I don't have a separate slide for, but it's like when you read Shakespeare. To my understanding, and I am not a Shakespeare scholar, I am a amateur Genji scholar. When all of the characters in a Shakespeare play are like speaking to each other in verse, I don't think it's implied to be that they're all actually just shooting off improv poetry at each other. Like, they are demonstrating wit off the cuff, but I don't think it's implied that everyone just speaks in perfect verse. It's just like a style of the play. But people in that time were not actually just talking to each other in verse all the time. In Heian Era, they were! They actually were! So I like to compare it to rap battles. In Heian Era, if you are a noble, you have to assert dominance by getting into rap battles with everyone you meet. And I think that's delightful. And that's just not happening in other settings. It's only mildly related, but I had to include it somewhere. My favorite Heian Era meme. How many levels of Heian period are you on? At present 6? Perhaps 7? Greener than the peaks of Mount Hiei in springtime are you. Observe. And then the screenshot. A few years earlier, she had been plunged into grief over the death of a young Fujiwara lady whom she had never even met, but whose calligraphy she admired. It'd be like that. Yes, so Heian Era. Fascinating frickin' setting that, like, we've had love stories since, we've had psychological novels since, we've had fascinatingly flawed, absolutely obnoxious characters since, we've had frickin' Gary Stu harem protagonists since, but you don't have a lot of stories that have these poetry battles and all these weird antics that could only happen because they take place in the Heian Era. And the thing is, so I said before, I first studied Genji in a Japanese art history class. It wasn't the first unit, it was somewhere in the middle, and then we moved on to the Tale of Heike, which I personally found really boring. The Tokugawa era with the samurai sort of taking over the government from these Heian Era nobles. Really boring for art history, it turns out. And then we get the Edo period and the people of Edo after this long period of warring states, the civil war, these uprisings, burning of temples, all that stuff. They want to remember peace and to embrace the peace times, and they think of the Heian Era as their peaceful times, the times before all the war and the scary and the chaos. And what is the most well-preserved work of the Heian period that people went out of their way to make sure didn't get burned up in the second Thursday's fire? Tale of Genji. So they look to that, and it inspires a lot of Edo era art, which I will go into on the next slide. And then after that is the Meiji era. Japan opens its doors to more Western influence, and as they are doing that, they want to sort of present themselves to the world with a united and cohesive Japanese identity. And for much of their history, they had been leaning a lot on Chinese culture. They borrowed their writing system. They had the Buddhism. A lot of the poetry culture was actually inspired from Chinese, because they were working with like Chinese dignitaries and they wanted to be taken seriously by them. Over time, they went, no, we need to have our own culture. We're going to tap into what makes us Japanese. And what is the thing that they look to and go, that is a Japanese point of pride, that is a big Japanese cultural touchstone? They look at Genji. And so they're using their brand new writing system that they've been cooking up. The government is actually hiring people to write novels so that they can like export culture and say, look at us and our unified cultural identity. World, you're getting to know us. This is who we are. They fund a lot of culture in the Meiji era. And those writers, they're getting inspired by Genji. And then in the modern day, people are taking these old Genjis or anything else from the Heian era where everything was being set on fire. We don't have a whole lot from back during that time. Part of the reason we don't have a lot of like historical dramas and things like that set during the Heian period is because everyone is talking to each other behind screens through esoteric poetry that you need to have memorized to be accurate to the setting. And so no one wants to write a story like that because its audience is very small. Another reason is we don't have that much information about it. If you look into anything from the Heian period, you look at the Diary of Murasaki Shikibu, the Kagero Niki, Sei Shogunan, the Pillow Book. I picked up my Pillow Book. I finally got a copy. And I read the introduction, and at the end of the introduction, it says, like, I am a scholar. I did a bunch of work to translate this really old text, and I went through different interpretations by different historians. Like, I worked with other scholars who work in this field of translating this era of history to understand all of these anecdotes. And there isn't a lot written about the Pillow Book or even about the Heian era in general. So if you want to read more, here's a few names of essays written about Genji. And I saw that and my heart broke. Genji isn't all we have, but when I was researching for this PowerPoint, I reference all these art concepts, not just from the Heian era, but from the Edo period and the Meiji period. I looked at the Minneapolis Institute of Art, had some articles, the Met Gallery in New York, a no play sort of informational guide, a lot of Wikipedia. I keep looking up all of these historical concepts, and I couldn't get through a single page without finding a link back to Genji. It's everywhere. It's everywhere. Also, this little picture is from a manga adaptation of The Diary of a Princess. I'm forgetting her name, but she was well known for being really big on Genji, and Genji scholars kind of use her diary to demonstrate just how big Genji fever was back during its own time, and also to trace like how easy it was to get a copy, how it was being passed around, because for her birthday one year, she got a complete set of Genji and she locked herself in her room and read it all night. And this is an illustrated panel of a manga about that bit, and it's real cute. And so I put it there. So, impacts of Genji. I've discussed it, but this is a Genji illustration. It's on the frickin' money. This picture right here, this is from the Genji Museum. I want to go to the Genji Museum! I talked earlier about Mono no Oware. I sort of spoiled that point in this presentation, but Mono no Oware is considered a foundational philosophy to Japanese identity, and it was coined while talking about Genji, and Genji is the big sort of example of it, and it's absolutely everywhere in Japanese aesthetics. Rusu Moyo I got from a museum that I went to in person here in the US of A. They were actually holding a series of lectures on Genji that was very, very enjoyable. I was so hyped. It talks about how there are certain motifs that not even like scenes like frickin' Genji peeking through a screen at Utsusemi, but things like Yugao, the flower, and the folding fan is the one they reference here, I think. No, they talk about chapter 24 with a boat party. There's all these just like, you put a flower a certain way, you put a few just scenery objects a certain way, and you reference Genji. And little motifs, these little references were all over in like woodblock paintings. They were used a lot in Yamanote. I already said the oldest surviving Yamanote Emaki hand illustrated scrolls we have that aren't Buddhist are Genji. Rinpa paintings are pretty similar. It's sort of a school of painting, but it's based on doing like figureless scenes, and it's inspired by Genji, and so this entire school of painting. When you just go and look up just a painting, chances are on your first page of Google image search or whatever, you're looking at an illustration of Genji. You find your freaking generic old-looking Japanese art picture, there's a decent chance you're looking at Genji. I see it everywhere now. I keep going like, oh my gosh, wait a second, that's the Typhoon chapter, isn't it? That's the Hotaru chapter, isn't it? I can see it! It's everywhere! This is what it means to be a Genji scholar. And to yandere's, some people say that the Rokujo Haven was actually the first yandere. You can argue with that if you want, but it's pretty funny to think about. But like I said, I see it everywhere, and then I start to do it too. This is me remaking the Hotaru scene in Revu Starlight phone game. Every time I get a phone game where you can decorate a space, I end up making Genji chapters! Which, this is a cry for help. I opened Animal Crossing for the first time in over 2 years to tell you about my Animal Crossing island. So here I set out to create Genji Land. That's not actually the name of my island, but that's basically the name of my island. Here you can see me in front of Genji's house. I should have actually put a picture of Genji the rabbit. There's a character in Animal Crossing named Genji. Maybe we can find him right now. Genji, Animal Crossing. He's a jock, which offends my sensibilities, but this is Genji. So I said, I need to have him. And I must allow him to ascend. So I used the terraforming to put his house. His house is actually the only thing in my island that is on the 3rd tier of elevation, because the Emperor must ascend to the clouds. And of course, he must have a house. A big house with 4 houses based on the seasons for his principal wives. So you can see Annalisa is actually, I think she came with my island, which was great. And what inspired me to do this? She's the Lady of Spring, so I put a bunch of Sakura-themed items by her house. The Lady of Fall should be Lady Akashi, but I found Greta, and she makes this really scary face. So she is my Rokujo Haven, and there's like a tombstone here because she's all haunty, and I have orange flowers there. The Lady of Winter, Blanche, is this ostrich's name. I used some hacked QR code things because I didn't want to actually get the amiibo cards, but I hacked her onto my island, and hard to make the snow, so I just put a bunch of white flowers there. And then I was running out of Geisha Animal Crossing characters, so I don't actually have him yet, but Kabuki, the cat, is there to honor Tono Chujo and Utsusemi's little brother, all of the men who are gay for Genji. They have rights, and so the house for summer actually has a few references themselves. So also outside the houses, I have this little cart, which we've talked about, one of my favorite chapters, the cart battle. So the closest cart I could find was a little flower cart. and I just crashed it into the side of Rokujo's house. And then here, we actually have 2 references by the Lady of Summer's house. This is the model of a firefly that I got from Flick, because the Hotaru chapter I keep talking about, it's with Lady Akashi's daughter, where basically this guy's trying to flirt with Genji's daughter, and she's being shy, and the guy goes, "Hey Genji, your daughter is so hot and I want to get with her, please get me an in here." And so he releases a bunch of fireflies in front of her standing screen so that the guy can see her silhouette, which, scandalous, absolutely perverted. Her silhouette. But it's one of the most visually striking chapters to imagine, so I keep recreating that one. But also the standing screen that I have there is my little reference to the Typhoon chapter, which is a similarly indecent chapter. It's at Genji's house, but I think it's Genji walking around with his son, or his son walking around, and a typhoon has whipped by, and all of these standing screens are removable. These houses are really fragile. You can just kind of fold them up and take them with you if you want. So this big storm comes through and it just knocks half the walls off the house. And all the ladies in waiting are going out and reconstructing the house, picking up all the screens. And Genji's son is walking around and just sees a bunch of women in the open because there are no walls. Gasp! So I snuck in 2 references there. And then I also have a separate house that's on the other side of the river, but in the same area as the seasonal houses, that is for Safflower. This is the Lady Safflower's house. I didn't put the monkey, but there's another Animal Crossing lady with red cheeks. So I planted all these safflowers. That's not what they're actually called in the game, but these red little flowers all over the house. There's also a scary face I planted here, which is basically another Rokujo jump scare. And also there is one other place where I used a higher elevation only because I wanted to have this backing bamboo. This is like the summer house where Yugao died, which is why there has to be a haunty face here. And that's not even the full extent of my crimes, because I've also made Pokemon teams of really... I've told you about how messed up these stories are, so you can actually probably get some of these references, like Murasaki Substitute. I think you can understand that one. Aoi no Ue, Perish-san, because she frickin' dies, and she was mean, so she has Outrage and Toxic and Fury Attack. Yugao, Destiny Bond and Memento. Rokujo, Poltergeist, Destiny Bond, Sleep Talk, because she would haunt women in her sleep. Akashi, Worry Seed and Endure, because she was there being the secondary wife to Murasaki, and her kid was being handed to Murasaki, and she was just enduring it. San no Miya, baby doll eyes, stomping tantrum because she's baby. This is no longer a cry for help. This is just a confession. I've committed crimes. These are crimes. But I'm not the only one who's committed crimes, because you see, Genji, despite the difficulty to adapt this story because of the weirdness of Heian Era, people have sort of adapted away some of the more difficult things and worked hard to preserve Genji in the form of mangas. Some are educational, some are just dramatizations. There's been movies. There's been animes. Some of these are from like the 70s. Some of these are from like 2020 or 2021. And then these are just the ones that play Genji straight. Not even going into things that play off the themes of Genji. This is Minamoto-san no Monogatari, which is a story of a high school boy who moves in with his literature, basically Genji scholar aunt, who says, "Hey, nephew, I'm going to hook you up with 14 different women because you have a trauma against women, and I have a doctorate to write, and I'm going to cure your fear of women by hand-selecting 14 girls and making you smash them." It was apparently in Shonen Jump for a while. I haven't actually read it. I found it over the course of when I was at that lecture series about Genji, there was a reverse harem manga for Genji that I actually really want to read, because the lecturer showed like the characters page and described all these guys that represented the different wives of Genji, and played into all these harem tropes of like the tsundere and the yandere and stuff, and it looked really funny, and I cannot find it. I did, however, find this phone game, which I know nothing about, but all the images of it are really funny. And I don't know how Genji, this reverse Genji romance is, but the ways in which we cannot escape Genji extends into the modern day. And I don't know how good a job they do of it. I haven't actually delved nearly enough into any of these Genji adaptations, and I really should, so that I can go frickin' bonkers. I just feel like if I'm not reading the poems, it won't hit the same way, because as you have observed, I'm fascinated by the aesthetics and the way language is used, and the way the names aren't real, and the poems require 17 footnotes. I'm less invested in these actual horrible characters. Or no, horrible character singular, Genji sucks, everyone else is an unfortunate victim, but nonetheless, I really should get around to it. Apparently, there was like an art museum that commissioned a new Genji anime recently. It's supposed to be very pretty. I haven't watched it. Maybe you could, and unfortunately experience the story. Or you could get the Tyler Royal translation of Genji, which is 1,102 pages long, not counting appendixes. So, in conclusion, Genji is the price we pay to experience the wild world of the Heian Era. Genji no yatsu wa saite na no otoko. And also, despite all of its weirdness and squickness and gross, I cannot shut up about it. And maybe now, when it somehow comes up in conversation, or when you look at a woodblock painting, you'll turn to someone and say, "Hey, wanna hear something really frickin' weird?" And if you do, then I will have done my job well.